right? Praising God and thanking him this time for divine intervention, a Bible school or preaching school term that talks about the ways in which he intervenes in circumstances in ways that sometimes make me scratch my head and say, is this actually the finger of God or God's intervention in a certain situation? That has nothing to do with what I want to title this though, but I took a pause between the last video and this one when I really wanted to just power through, but I got a chance to listen to a group of content creators called the Trackstarz talk about something that seemed to be super consistent with what I thought this chapter might have been talking about. So I want to give them a shout out and talk about the way that that divine intervention might have helped me title and focus this chapter, Ezekiel 32, around verse 13. A verse that talks about many waters, a metaphor that will carry forward to the Revelation, where one of the angels interpreting the Revelation for John will literally describe the many waters as peoples or people groups out of which different judgments or different elements of the Revelation will flow. So that may be the metaphor that carries through here in this chapter that calls for Ezekiel to make a lamentation over Pharaoh in the first 16 verses or so, at which it is going to, at which point it is going to change into a description of the context in which Pharaoh is going to find himself descending into Sheol. But as opposed to the way his presence and the presence of the Assyrians might have encouraged those who went on before them for dying maybe in their transgressions, he is going to be comforted by those he sees following him, probably for doing some of the same things or making some of the same mistakes he did. Understand that I'm 2 minutes into this video and we hadn't started talking about nothing. Let's get started with the chapter summary. In verses 1 through 16, as we said, it's going to start with a call to Ezekiel to make a lamentation over Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Verse 2, I guess, focusing on his faulty vision, saying, you consider yourself a lion of the nations, but you are like a dragon in the seas. I don't want to make too many pauses for metaphors, but dragon imagery goes throughout the Bible, once again to the Revelation, where there is a dragon with 7 heads that is described as Satan himself, who produces a beast with 7 heads that acts in the power of Satan. It is not the only time we see dragon imagery in the Bible, and not every time that we see dragon imagery is it directly related to Satan. But usually when we see dragon imagery in the Bible, the future for that dragon is not good. Whether or not Pharaoh has begun to take on the very characteristics or imagery of Satan himself, he is taking on the image of one who God has condemned, and therefore he is being lamented in this chapter that goes on in the next few verses 3 through 8 to itemize some of the things that God will do to Pharaoh in that judgment. I will cast you on the ground. I will cause the birds of the heaven to settle on you. I will gorge the beasts of the whole earth with you. Going on to make a shorter work of the description, he will strew, fill, drench, and do all kinds of things when in verse 7, he blots them out. He will go on to talk about, once again, a familiar passage, the way that he is going to do this by the sword of the king of Babylon in verse 11. But before we get there, in verses 9 and 10, he is going to talk about the way in which, even though, as we mentioned, Egypt, like these other kingdoms, were once the astonishment or the awe of all the nations around them, they are going to flip and be the reason why many nations are appalled. Understanding, we mentioned before, the degree to which, as people, we will either be exemplary in the things that God has called us to do, or we will be made an example of. And that seems to be the imagery that we see here regarding Egypt, in the same way God has used that imagery regarding his own people, Israel and Judah. Going on again, as we mentioned in verses 11 through 16, maybe to talk about the way in which they are going to fall by the hands of the king of Babylon. That many waters imagery coming up, in, as we mentioned, verse 13, providing a bookend where he originally mentioned the way in which they troubled the waters in verse 2. I skipped over that in the original description. So many waters does not simply come up at the end of the lament. It comes up at the beginning of the lament, and it really sets the stage for that context we mentioned in the second half of the verse, because all of the other nations that God has sent or will send after Egypt to the pit, even if they are not described as having troubled the waters, literally using that same metaphor. They're going to be described as having spread terror with their power and influence. Verse 22, talking about Assyria being there. In verse 23, saying, who spread terror in the land of the living. Verse 24, describing Elam. I believe that's a city or a major stronghold of the Persians, who in verse, or that same verse said, who spread their terror in the land of the living. They seem to get two shout outs because in verse 25, it's going to say that they're not their mighty men, but they're going to be slain by the sword, for terror of them was spread in the land of the living. Verse 26 going on to talk about a nation I'm not familiar with, but described as Meshech Tubal being there, because in the second half of verse 26, it's going to say, for they spread their terror in the land of the living, talking about their mighty men, more specifically in verse 27, for the terror of the mighty men was in the land of the living. Edom in verse 29 is described as being there. The only nation in this sequence that I think is not described as having spread their terror, they are still described as who for all their might are laid with those who are killed by the sword. They lie with the uncircumcised who go down to the pit. Verse 30, talking about the princes of the north, understanding that the number of judgments that God brings against his people from the north, he's going to say they will have their turn as well, including the Sidonians, who, verse 30, will say, who have gone down in shame with the slain for all the terror that they caused by their might. Verse 31, going on to talk about Pharaoh's comfort, saying, when Pharaoh sees them, he will be comforted for all his multitude. Pharaoh and all his army slain by the sword, declares the Lord. Verse 32, concluding, for I spread terror in the land of the living, meaning if you think you can do dirt, I can make payment or recompensation for all the dirt that has been done for those who are spreading terror in the land of the living. That is my ad lib. It literally goes on to say, and he shall be laid to rest among the uncircumcised with those who are slain by the sword. Pharaoh and all his multitude, declares the Lord God. This chapter reminding me of the aforementioned content from those brothers, the Trackstarz, who also do Christian content just on a much larger platform. But they were commenting on a video that they saw from a young lady who was otherwise what we would call spitting wisdom, talking about the way we have to run with endurance this life, because trying to sprint towards perfection can simply leave you gassed out. That's my paraphrase. And in hearing her talk about the way in which she had to narrow her focus to concentrate on the things that God had for her to do, one of those brothers cautioned her not to focus so much on God that she began to lose sight of the role that God had for her in the lives of people, especially the people around her, because she is a content creator and influencer as well, reminding me of this chapter where whether or not Pharaoh had begun to take on the very imagery of Satan himself, Satan was getting a lot of mileage out of Pharaoh and the nations that were going to follow him down into the pit for the way that they had begun to terrorize, as we've mentioned before, some of the very same people that God might have actually empowered them to protect.